Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Lynn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning and welcome to Ethical Perspectives on the News. I'm your moderator, Karl Cassell, President and CEO of Horizons, a Family Service Alliance. The long-awaited future has arrived. Technology has finally given us the opportunity to experience reality in a virtual environment. Joining me today, we have three guests that will help us explore the reality of virtual reality. To my immediate left, we have Damsteegt, Family Psychology Associates. Good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
Next to him in the middle, we have McCreary, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Kirkwood Community College. Good morning.
Hello, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And on our far left, Juan Pablo Hourcade, Associate Professor of Computer Science at the University of Iowa. Good morning.
Good morning, Karl.
Well, and so, as I mentioned, the future has arrived. Virtual reality, immersive environments, and so I want you guys to really, for our studio viewers this morning, or excuse me, for our television viewers this morning, really kind of talk about what is happening in virtual reality. What are the pros, the cons? Why is this so exciting? Why are we seeing so much money by venture capitalists poured into this form of technology? And so, to start us out, a kind of general question, what is the difference between augmented reality and virtual reality? Anyone?
All right. So as the computer scientist here, I'm going to take that one, Karl. So with virtual reality, what we're talking about is technologies that provide, as you mentioned, immersive experiences that are typically also interactive. So you don't just experience it, but you interact with the system, and they provide simulations of worlds that might be real or imagined. So that's what we get with virtual reality. Augmented reality is a little bit different in that we still perceive the world around us, but augmented reality systems add information to it. So for example, I might put on some glasses that remind me of all of your names. For example, I could see a little bit of text under your face telling me your name and maybe some other information. So that would be an example of augmented reality.
Okay. Let me just follow up on that, because I think of the old Terminator movies, and on his screen, he's computing information. Is that somewhat what augmented reality would produce, be able to give us a similar sort of understanding or information in real time?
Yeah, so nowadays, for example, you can think of how we rely on our smartphones to give us information, sometimes as we're driving, sometimes as we're walking. Maybe we're trying to get to some place, or we're in a city we don't know, we're walking in a street with a lot of restaurants, we wonder, well, what are my options here? Maybe an augmented reality system could give you all that information in a more convenient way, so you don't have to be taking your phone out, for example.
Absolutely. Anyone else want to comment on any portion of that question?
No.
Okay. So how long has this technology been in the works, and why towards the end of 2015 and now in 2016 is it becoming so pervasive? Why is everybody so excited about virtual reality?
I can talk a little bit about the origins again.
Yeah.
So one of the first systems, perhaps the first one where you could actually call it virtual reality, it dates back to the mid-1960s. It was put together by Ivan Sutherland, who was one of the pioneers in computer graphics and human-computer interaction as well. And he had a system where he had a head-mounted display like the ones you see now, and it was interactive. Obviously, the things he could do back then were very limited, but that was some of the first systems. By the mid-'80s, you had commercial ventures where you had video game consoles supporting some virtual reality aspects and head-mounted displays. Not very advanced, obviously. What we're having now is that obviously our hardware is much, much better, so we can process all that information a lot quicker and develop much higher quality graphics a lot faster, and that's providing us with much higher quality virtual reality. The other thing that's happened is smartphones. With smartphones being produced by the millions and millions, The cost of those really small processors that process information really quickly has gone down significantly. In addition to the cost of all the sensors that come in the phones that tell you which way you're moving, those have come down in cost significantly. And that's enabled products like Oculus Rift, which would have cost a lot more money if we didn't have this economies of scale just a few years ago, and now they can put them together for much less.
So talk to me a little bit about the social ramifications, the psychology, the psychological ramifications that go into this. Either one of you, is this all good? Is it all bad? Somewhere in between? And what could be the ramifications for, as I think of young children who will experience this sort of technology for the remainder of their lives?
I can't really speak about the ramifications. I don't understand them that well to know. The place where psychologists have used virtual reality is in therapy. And so for the last maybe 10, 15 years or longer, people have been using virtual reality simulations to help people overcome various problems. Like, for example, a fear of heights. One could, in virtual reality, go up an elevator to the 40th floor and back down again without actually moving. And then that desensitizes them so that when they actually are on a real elevator, they don't get so frightened from heights, or from flying, or from other, especially fear-based problems. It's been used in treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so soldiers who have been traumatized, for example, in the Middle Eastern wars, could have a simulated environment which they experience, bring back a lot of the feelings and the memories to help them work through the problems that they've been blocking out. And I don't know how commonly this is used, but I know it has been used in VA hospitals, different places, including in Des Moines, I believe.
And so obviously with technology, I think it's clear that it won't be all bad or all good. And Don just mentioned a lot of really good uses, I think, for some of this kinds of technology. What's concerning to me is that all throughout the history of philosophy, there's this strong impulse towards knowing the truth, knowing what is real. And likewise, we see evidence in just human nature that humans tend to want distractions. So while technology obviously can be used in positive ways, we know that for the most part, technology is used for mundane things, amusement, relaxation, which again is fine. There's nothing wrong with that until it gets to the point of people being consumed, or there are people throwing around words like being addicted to technology. Whether that's accurate or not is not for me to say, but back in 1848, you have Soren Kierkegaard writing about in Copenhagen how noisy everything is, and people just want distractions, and they just need silence, really, to think through life. And 200 years before that, you have Pascal writing about how humans simply seek diversion, and we simply crave distractions to avoid thinking about our miseries.
Right. Yeah.
And the concerning part for me with technology is that people will use it to avoid real life in harmful ways.
Okay.
I think you're broadening the application here of the term virtual reality to include other kinds of, say, video games or cell phones or headphones, that are blocking our experience of what's right in front of us.
Right, and so with virtual reality in particular, what I found interesting in thinking about is, for instance, video games. When I just looked up some things with current states of virtual reality, most applications I saw were for video games at this point.
Yep.
And at first, it seems video games began almost as a distraction, as amusement and relaxation, but also as a way to just distract ourselves from things. And now with virtual reality, we put on the headset, and it's like the real world is now the distraction. We want to immerse ourselves in virtual reality with video games in order not to be distracted by what used to be most important.
And so let me follow up on something both of you said as you start talking about the sphere of heights and some of those things. So if someone, like the Oculus Rift you brought up, it causes us to maybe use only 2 of our senses. So it has an effect on prediction in the brain. So someone that would experience falling over a cliff, for instance, will it cause confusion in the real world? Will they start, at some level, end up thinking they can survive falls? I mean, will there cause some confusion in the brain if this becomes pervasive use, if they start using that technology pervasively?
Well, I don't know. I think anything in excess is going to be a problem, but I don't see that as a big problem. What we want is for people to have a brain-based response that is appropriate to the real world around them. And so if a person is having a strong fear response to heights, let's say, their brain is way overreacting to what the real world is giving them. So by desensitizing them through virtual reality, they then will have a correct response, you might say, to the real situation. But I can't say what would happen if a person were constantly in the virtual reality. Would that cause problems? I suppose it would, but I don't know how to talk about that.
Okay. Well, and Mark, you talked about the distraction and the use of the video games. People won't want to leave. I mean, it is as all-consuming as it can possibly be. What is the fear that people will not want to come back to the real world?
What is the fear? I think when you look at the deeper questions of life, you know, what is our purpose? Is there a God? What is the nature of good? Again, we have a tendency to skirt the issues, many of us, obviously not all. And the fear is that newer technologies will allow us with greater and increasing capacity to avoid those types of questions for longer. But at the same time, I see a lot of promise, much like Don was saying, and with education, for instance, I can see lots of possible benefits for things like virtual reality. In philosophy, we often use these things called thought experiments, where we imagine hypothetical scenarios, and thinking through those imaginative scenarios gives us great insight and clarity in decision making and value, and to be able to perhaps one day have a virtual reality headset where the students could be immersed would be a wonderful thing. And that would actually be a way to harness technology to help avoid distractions and to focus on what's important. So again, not all good, not all bad.
So let me delve back into some of the uses for education. Sure. Do we see this happening now, and how much more will it happen? Will it change the need for people to travel, to be educated, to travel to foreign lands, if they can be immersed in an augmented or virtual reality to either learn or to travel?
I think there are lots of opportunities for education. I could think of history. Imagine walking through the streets of ancient Rome, for example, to really understand what it's like. And there are folks who are actually actively working in that area now, and trying to rebuild all those ancient sites and enabling you to experience them. We can also think about it as creating today the great history for the future, right? So really have excellent way of capturing our current world, so people in the future can see what it was like to walk down the streets of Cedar Rapids in 2016. We now have the technology where we could actually capture things in such a way that we can give people a much better sense of what things were like today. Another technology it's not virtual reality, but it's somewhere related, is telepresence. And we were starting to see that in some conferences, for example, that I attend. Especially being useful for people who, for whatever reason, cannot travel to the conference. We have these little robots that they can control remotely, and we see their faces. And they can actually see and hear what's going on and go to a specific room to hear a specific talk, ask questions, interact with other people. So that's one way of not having to necessarily show up for the business meeting and still be there in a way. It's being used in medicine as well.
What is that called?
Telepresence.
Telepresence. Oh my goodness.
Or holograms. I mean, they're holographic images where either they're bringing people back that were dead, or individuals who are alive that can be in a place that could sit on stage and interact with us as if they were really here.
Yeah.
I mean, we're just beginning to scratch the surface, and so, I mean, it's.
There's many things you could do. For example, you could imagine, would you want to see what it's like to be the quarterback at the Super Bowl, right? So you could see the action from that perspective, and that would be a little different. It wouldn't be interactive, but it could be quite immersive as well.
Right.
Yeah.
So if we can get experience in the virtual world that are compelling on a sexual nature, or gratifying, or exciting, or even what we would consider wondrous, expansive in our mind, how might this change the way we choose to spend our free time out of virtual reality? Will we thrill seek more, less, because we can go virtual reality? Will we become sort of recluse until we can put on the headset and go? What are some of the ways that this would change our use of free time?
For my part, I think it will increase what I would say is the natural tendency towards self-centeredness of just wanting to focus on what I want to focus on. I think we're already, not the technology itself, but the way many people use technology already is habituating so many people to turn away from those physically right in front of them, to turn away from even their own inner lives or thoughts, and just to be directed externally. And I think that that may only increase.
Well, your question reminds me of teenagers who are always on their phones, even in a restaurant, or on their phones, talking possibly to the next person instead of face-to-face, or talking by text on the phone.
Yeah, so it's a challenge, right? Because it's technologies that make it in many ways easier to connect with those who are remotely. Actually, we're getting close to pretty much you can connect with anyone, anywhere in the world, just about. But at the same time, they do tend to get in the way of face-to-face communication. So one thing I can say is, in some cases, they can actually augment face-to-face communication. So, for example, you have people who have difficulty communicating face-to-face, for example, people diagnosed with autism. So there's technologies that can help them communicate, and in that sense, it's possible for technologies to expand face-to-face communication or make it easier. But it's true that in most cases, the technologies have been designed without necessarily caring for that face-to-face communication, and in some ways, they're a great way of competing with the people who are near you. All the apps are saying, hey, look at me, listen to me, I have something really interesting for you. And it's hard to say for teenagers to talk to their siblings when there's that app giving them exactly what they want.
This it seems to also now preclude any sense of healthy solitude in what I've seen in the college students that I teach. I often assign an assignment where I make them spend 30 minutes with no electronics, no other people, just thinking. And what they think about is up to them. And then write a brief reflection on how it went. And over, some of them enjoy it and it's rewarding, but over and over, they use words like addicted and consumed with technology, that they realize that all they wanted to do was grab their phone to see if anyone liked their recent post. And they use the word bored over and over. And some even are very honest, and they say, I realize now I keep myself busy, so I don't have to think about things that I don't want to think about. And that's the recurring theme that I see when I sort of force them to quote, unplug for just 30 minutes.
Very interesting. And there's a strong movement in psychotherapy toward mindfulness these days. And mindfulness is just the opposite of that, where you are just really paying attention dispassionately to what your experience is, what your thoughts are, what your senses tell you.
And that could be done anywhere at any time, right?
Right. And so mindfulness is kind of the opposite. You're describing mindlessness. And so mindfulness is what psychology is often helping people to accomplish and helping them to have better lives as a result.
I'm not sure what you mean by mindlessness, right?
Trying to avoid thinking about something, trying to...
On their part.
On their part.
Okay, yes.
Yes.
And so would you say that's almost a regression in human behavior? If we're mindless instead of mindful, and the technology is causing us to be distracted or at least be so consumed with living in a virtual world, even though the technology is advancing, would human interaction be regressing at some level? How would you view that?
I think that's the danger, is that that young people, especially who are using all the technology constantly and are not, communicating face to face, are not learning those complex social skills that they need to be successful in a complex society.
Okay.
Yeah, so one of the ways in which I think about technology is that in many ways it gives us cognitive superpowers, so it expands what we can do. But sometimes you have to be careful what you wish for. And not all superpowers might end up making you happier, giving you a more fulfilling life, or enabling you to live in a complex world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one way to think about this. Being able to access all this information and all this gratifying information out there, in some ways it is a superpower, something no one could do before. But at the same time, it can lead to problems, right? Yeah. So sometimes you see these movies where somebody gets a superpower and they get in trouble because they don't use it the right way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so let's kind of build on that. Because some of these sensory experiences can include sight, sound, or touch. It gives you somewhat superpowers. And so could this, it always goes back to something that was developed for good could be used for something bad. Mm-hmm. Could it affect sports? If there is a method to increase your eyesight, could I become a better hitter? I can see the ball clear, or touch, I can feel the ball, just all of the things, and I'm just using sport because that's an easy example, but could it create a situation where it creates a larger gap between folks who are trying to achieve in certain areas, or even in learning, because they're able to use the technology or have access to the technology that other folks don't? I think of, just to kind of finish this point, the digital divide before. People had computers, some people didn't. Virtual reality could somewhat start creating that divide. Do you see that as something that could happen?
Yeah, I think that's a concern with any new technology, where obviously it's always going to be the people who are wealthier who are going to get to use it first. I think in some respects the digital divide has not been as terrible as we thought it would be in terms of having access to technology. So now we have most of the world with access to cell phones, with access to the internet. The problem is oftentimes the software that gets put together, or the applications that are available, are those that matter for wealthy people as opposed to those that might be relevant for people who are disadvantaged. So for example, think of smartphones that we all know about. If I go to a city I've never been to, it's very easy for me to get an app where I can find a nice place to dine. But if you're on a low income and you have to feed your family this weekend and you only have $40, there's no app for you to find the most nutritious food that you can get within your neighborhood. So the technology is there. They might have the smartphone, the app's not there. Right. So sometimes it gets a little more complicated than just access to the technology, but what can you do with it? Can you do something that's relevant to the people who need it the most?
And I just have one real final question, and I hope you all will weigh in on this. Can virtual reality, or is there potential to have adverse effects on our brain? Having these headsets on all the time that put us in a world that isn't real, does this or can it have an adverse effect on our brains? Al, I'll start
I
with
don't
you.
know. I don't have any data or understanding to answer that question. I would think the answer is possibly, but I don't know.
Okay. Yeah.
And likewise about physically what goes on in the brain, I don't know. However, it's clear that what we think about matters, and what we think about habitually shapes much of our character, which will then carry over in all aspects of our life.
Yeah, I think, as was mentioned earlier, the issue might be addiction. Once you get to a point where it's too much, then there's likely to be negative effects. Other than that, it's likely to be like all our other technologies. We'll adapt to it and eventually, hopefully, figure out the best uses for it.
Just one quick final question again. How long do we think this will be available to everybody? I know just over the last 365 days, it's really started to kind of hit the mainstream. How long before the price comes down where it's available to the majority of the population?
It's hard to tell, so it depends on how popular it becomes. So the more they make, the less expensive it will become, and then there will be more of them out there. There's little quirks still to be worked on, so some people, like I'm one of them, we get dizzy when we use them. So it's not something where, like a smartphone, where pretty much everybody can end up using it. At the end of the day, it depends on what are the uses, how many people actually find it useful or compelling enough to purchase it.
Any other final thoughts? Anything pressing you guys want to conclude with before we finish up here?
Well, as with the internet and a lot of other technology, the technology has outstripped our ethics and our guidelines for use. And so there's always a danger then that things will be misused.
And while something like virtual reality can help perhaps build critical thinking skills, what's going to, at the end of the day, have to happen is applying those skills in relevant ways in real life, in real work environments, and in real relationships.
Thank you. Well, we are out of time this morning, and I know we barely scratched the surface on the future and reality of virtual reality. For some, the technology is fascinating and can't develop fast enough. For others, they're a little nervous in that this presents ethical and social dilemmas that society might not be ready for. In the meantime, we will all continue to watch and learn how this technology will continue to shape our lives in ways before only imagined. Thank you and good morning, and please join us again on another episode of Ethical Perspectives on the News.